Hi KingsGate, welcome back to my house. Your trivia question, or maybe trivial question for this week is, after 6 weeks of lockdown, my hair had got to the point of becoming a trip hazard. And so, no barbers, Robin had to cut it. And so your thing to think about deeply for the next few minutes is, in this case, whether I just got her to cut the front and the sides, or whether she did the back as well, or whether I went for the lockdown mullet look. So think deeply about that one. Okay, so for the last number of weeks, if you've been watching, if you've been following, we've been tracking the story of Exodus and the Israelite people leaving leaving Egypt, out of slavery, out of bondage, out of captivity, crossing the Red Sea, and heading for the promised land, and God guiding them as they went. And we've been drawing conclusions, we've been drawing lessons that we can learn for the circumstances that we find ourselves in from that story. Now, as I launch into this, there's just one thing to remember, or a few things to remember in this. There's a broad range of experiences that different people are having throughout this coronavirus crisis. There are people that are grieving. Whether that's for the loss of a loved one, whether that's the loss of a job, whether that's the loss of security, whether that's loss of freedom, being unable to leave their homes. They're really struggling and grieving. There's other people that's just like they can breathe. They slow down. It feels like they've got off the hamster wheel of life, and it's just so much better. There are those that are frazzled, either from like hours on end on Zoom calls and conference calls, or from trying to homeschool that they never chose and trying to keep small children occupied in confined spaces. And there's others that are just going, oh, this is so incredible. I've got my DIY list ticked off. I've got my holiday photographs sorted for the first time in forever. And I feel like I can see the wood for the trees for the first time in I don't know how long. So the reality is you're going to have a broad range of experiences. You're going to have a broad range of views and emotional states in this. But I want to look at one particular aspect as we look today at Exodus 22, just one verse and one story. So it says in it's not Exodus 22, it's Exodus 15 verse 22. So then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea and into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah, which means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" And so we've seen this incredible story as they've been set free by God, as God has demonstrated his power, as he's part of the Red Sea, and they've crossed over on dry land, and then the sea has come back in, drowned their enemies, wiped out all their oppressors, their captives, and they've celebrated wildly on the shore as everything from their past, everything that held them, has been wiped out. And then they set off, and after 3 days, circumstances have changed. They've run out of water, and now they're grumbling. Now they're not happy. Now they're looking for somebody to blame. And this pattern repeats over and over again throughout the story of Exodus, Leviticus, and into Numbers. We see them. God does something. God provides. And it's like, way, we're amazing. God's amazing. We love you, God. Very, very quickly later, boom, hit a speed bump. Things not so good. And we also see, if you look in Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 to 3, an interesting little thing that gets added. They're saying, in Egypt we sat around pots of meat and all the food we wanted, but you brought us out here into the desert to starve. We see that again in Numbers as well, Numbers 11, where they're talking about the cucumbers and the melons and the garlic and the onions and the free fish that we had. It was so incredible, and you brought us out here to starve. And I'm going like, what planet are you on? Do any of you remember the midwives being instructed to kill your sons? Do any of you remember the slave drivers' whips? Do any of you remember the hardship that you're in? And you're remembering melons and cucumbers. Have you forgotten the slavery? And sometimes when we're in a difficult space, we romanticize the past. We airbrush all the difficulty of the past. We go, oh, it was so great back then. And we forget the troubles that we had then. But actually, when we stop and we think that every time has its own set of challenges, every time has its own set of difficulties, but as we hold on to God and we follow him, he gives us light and he leads us through those situations. And if you track the story through, you'll see this happens again and again and again. But in Numbers 14, verse 27, we see God's attitude to the way they're behaving. He says, "How long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites." And so we see that their response to their circumstances changing is that they grumble, they complain. They sit in their tents and they talk between each other and they express their disquiet and their unhappiness and they grumble and continue. So that's, if you like, a template for how not to deal with difficult situations. I want to look briefly at David. David, you might remember, is described by God as a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. So he's a good person for us to look at as a template. And so in Psalm 64 verse 1, David says, "Hear me, my God, as I voice my complaint. Protect my life from the threat of the enemy." And Psalm 142, 1 and 2, "I cry out to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble." You see the contrast here. The Israelites sat and grumbled and complained and talked between each other and moaned about their situation. David brings his complaint to God. David brings his struggle to God. You see, first and foremost, we bring our struggle to God. Yes, God puts people around us. God puts us in family. God puts us in community. But our first and foremost point of wrestle, and I'm going to contrast complaint and grumbling to wrestling and struggling with God. So when we complain and we grumble, we're festering in ourselves. We're just allowing the negative situation that we're in to build and to grow in our minds and to spread to other people. But when we bring our complaint, our grievance, when we bring our struggle to God and we pour out to him, one, he's able to speak his truth and his life into those situations. And two, we begin to see more clearly. So the first contrast is that David brings his complaint to God. The Israelites brought the complaint to each other and they grumbled about it and spread it around. The second contrast is that the grumbling and complaining actually is bad for your mental health. When we sit and we focus on the negative, on what's not happening, on what hasn't happened yet, when we fill our minds and rehearse over and over again, "I'm so unhappy about this, this is bad, and we go on like that, we actually fill our brains with toxic chemicals. And that makes it more and more difficult for us to see the positive, to find the positive, to think positively. It makes it harder and harder for us to see what God is doing. And we end up going down into this vicious cycle where the toxic thoughts lead to toxic chemicals in our mind, in our brain, and those toxic chemicals lead to more toxic thought, and it becomes a downward spiral. However, when we bring it to God, when we focus on and allow him to point us towards what's good and what is happening, that builds positive chemicals in our brain, that builds the serotonin levels in our brain. Serotonin makes us feel peaceful and thankful. Cortisol and the negative chemicals makes us feel anxious and stressed. And so even in a chemical level in our brain, as we process this with God and as we allow him to bring his truth into the situations, it's better for our mental health. The third contrast is that grumbling and complaining spreads dissatisfaction among others. It spreads like a virus. See, when I grumble and I complain and I talk to other people and I draw them into my struggle and we talk about how this is not good enough and how God hasn't yet done it, all this it just spreads through other people. What's needed in those situations is somebody says, "No, stop, let's listen to what God has to say." You see, When I wrestle with him and I bring my genuine pain to him. And I think the Psalms are an outstanding template. God's put a whole book in the center of the Bible that give us a template for how to express our emotions, how to get them out there, how to bring them to him. God doesn't want us to bottle them up. God doesn't want them just to go like, oh, turn your frown upside down and pretend it doesn't exist. That's completely unhealthy. But as we bring them to him and as we express them to him, as we get them out, he brings healing into those situations. It's right and it's proper to grieve. There's a time to grieve. There's a time to dance. The Bible tells us that. And if you're struggling now, it's right to grieve. But let's bring it to God and let's let him bring healing into that situation. The fourth contrast is that grumbling and complaining ultimately says, God, I don't trust you. Ultimately, it's saying, God, I don't trust your character. When circumstances were good, when circumstances seemed great, God, you were amazing. I'm with you. But now circumstances have changed. There's been a downturn in what's happening. I've walked 3 days and the celebration has turned into looking for water. And what I'm saying is, God, I've trusted your character when things seem good. But now that things don't seem so good, maybe I don't trust your character. Maybe I don't trust that you love me. Maybe I don't trust that you care about me. Maybe you care about other people. But in my circumstances, I can't trust you. You see, that doubting God's character is the devil's oldest trick. You go back to the book of Genesis chapter 3. What does God say? What does the serpent say to Eve? Did God really say? And then Eve says, yes, God says we shouldn't eat the fruit from that tree. If we do, we'll die. And the serpent says, you won't surely die. God just knows that if you eat that, you'll become like him, having knowledge between good and evil. God doesn't want you to be like that. God's just some cosmic killjoy. He wants to keep the good things away from you. He wants to keep you down. He wants to keep you suppressed. This is the insinuation of what the serpent is saying, casting aspersions on God's character, causing Eve to go, yeah, maybe God's not so good. Maybe God doesn't love me. That's where trust, that's the root of where not trusting God's character comes from. And when we change our view of God's character based on our circumstances, we're buying into that lie. But when we bring our wrestles and our struggles to God, when we say, God, I'm coming to you with my pain, I'm bringing it to you, I trust you that you're my good, good Father, and that you understand pain. We're ultimately saying, God, I trust you, you won't mock me, you won't dismiss me, but you'll draw me to you, you'll hold me, you'll understand me, and ultimately you will help me to see the truth that you are with me. I may not understand the circumstances I'm in, I may never understand them, but when I spend time with him, he reminds me that he's good and he's got me. So 4 contrasts between how we can deal with struggles. Grumbling and complaint that leads to negative mental health, that spreads through other people, that expresses doubt in God. Grumbling and complaint that focuses on what he hasn't done yet, or coming to him, expressing how we feel, allowing him to speak his life into those situations, allowing him to speak his love into us, that remind us who he is and who we are, that improves our mental health and actually stops this thing spreading. For me, I was massively challenged a couple of weeks ago. At the start of our worship time, Lou read from the Passion Translation's rendering of Psalm 16 verse 5. It says, Lord, I have chosen you alone as my inheritance. You are my prize, my pleasure, my portion. I leave my destiny and its timing in your hands. Many of you will be more familiar with it from the NIV or the ESV. It says, the boundary lines have fallen in pleasant places for me. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. And I was just challenged as she read that. Is that universal truth for me? In other words, have the boundary lines still fallen in pleasant places for me in the midst of a lockdown? Or is that only the case when everything seems better? Have the boundary lines fallen in pleasant places for me all the time? Have I a delightful inheritance all the time? Because if you read the Passion translations of it, see, if I've chosen God alone as my inheritance, if I've chosen his presence, His love, being with Him. I can have that no matter what my circumstances are. I can have Him as my prize, Him as my portion, Him as my pleasure, no matter where I am and what my circumstances are. I'm challenged by that because I can't say with integrity, that's me, that's me every day. But I'm praying it. I'm saying, God, I want that to be my truth. I want to be able to say with integrity, I have chosen you alone as my inheritance. You are my prize. You are my pleasure. You are my portion. I leave my destiny and its timing in your hands. And so I want to leave you with this challenge. How are you going to respond to difficult situations? How are you going to respond to difficult circumstances? Are you going to be like the Israelites, grumbling, complaining, it's not fair? Or are you going to be like David, bringing your feelings, bringing your confusion, bringing your grief, bringing all of it to God and saying, God, you're my Father, you love me. Help me to see this situation as you see it, and help me to remember you are with me. You promise to be with me in this, and you care for me. Bless you, KingsGate. I look forward to seeing you the next time we meet.